All right. So hello. I'm Jason Ray Kearney, and I'm the managing editor of Spiral Tower Press. We publish Whetstone, um, Witch House, and most recently Waystation. And we also started this novella series called Keen Blades, which is it's the first print thing we've ever done. We're wanting them to be short, compressed, sword and sorcery stories, about 20,000, 25,000 words, and we want them to be experimental, whatever that means. So just pushing the boundaries of the genre. You can interpret that in any way you'd like. But we published our first one, a novella called "Hurled Headlong Flaming," or "The Bishop's Tale," and the author is Matt Holder, and I asked Matt to do a online conversation with me just to kind of talk about the book, its background, and maybe some of his influences, and just to learn a little bit more about the book, because it's really good. And so a few people have been reading it in the sword and sorcery community, and there's been some pretty cool reviews. People have said some nice things. So yeah, thanks Matt for doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I really appreciate it. I super appreciate all the readers that have picked it up and looked at it. It's a sort of strange little book, and I mean, we'll talk some about its origins or whatever, but it's a very it's a very like me book. Most people aren't going to know me like really personally, but if you did, there are so many little like just nerdy things that I am into that are in this book, and so I'm happy that it's out there and that it has that sort of pieces of me in there.
Well, no, that's really interesting. I told you I might get nerdy, but so there is in literary history we talk about different types of authorship. There's the one type of authorship which is T.S. Eliot talks about this, where he says there's the tradition, and writers are supposed to in their work they kind of get out of the way and allow the tradition to speak. I don't know if you know this essay tradition in the individual talent.
It's been a minute. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So in this essay, he's like, it's not about T.S. Eliot. It's about Western poetry or whatever. And then then there's the other model of authorship, which is more associated with like Coleridge and Byron and Keats, which is that like, no, this is a private psychodrama that like I'm exploring for my own purposes. Like that I'm basically writing this for myself, and if people get something out of it, then so be it, right? And so the spectrum is like, are you like a classical author, or are you a romantic author writing for yourself? And I feel like that's kind of that's what I pick up when I read Hurled Headlong Flaming, that it's like eclectic and unique. It's totally something that like you had some ideas that you just were exploring, and if other people might like it, then so be it.
Yeah, I I would say I definitely am more in that sort of. It was very much again written for myself. I probably don't know enough to be like Eliot's model of authorship. Like I mean, I studied English lit and I have the sort of background or whatever, but like, and I like Dante and Milton are obviously influences, but I'm not like super deeply embedded in that scholarship enough to really implant those ideas in the way that Eliot's talking about. But I do have a bunch of just little things that I'm interested in. And I mean, this has been said by a lot of different people who are a lot smarter than me, but like, and I don't necessarily like when I'm writing, it's very much for myself. I am sort of more of a writer who, I don't want to say doesn't care about the reader, because that seems wrong, but that's not necessarily like why, or I'm not really thinking about like how are they going to receive this necessarily, because it is like I mean, again, this has been said before, but like you write the book that like you would want to read, right? And I think the more you individualize and get more specific, it actually like feels more universal in some ways, because we and this is perhaps tangent. But like we
Tangential.
respond to stuff and we can feel someone's like specific enthusiasm for whatever it is, right? And it doesn't matter what it is. We just like respond as humans. We're just like, wow, this seems so interesting, and carpentry or whatever. So I try, like, and I'm a teacher too, so I'm always like, I pick texts, and I'm not thinking like, oh man, I hope my kids like this. Like, I don't care if they're probably not going to, like, who cares? But I have to be really invested in the text, because the hope, right, is that if they can see that I'm interested in it, that's what they'll respond to, is my own enthusiasm. So same when I, not the text itself. So the same way when I wrote this, it was, similar sort of, it feels weird to talk about myself as a writer in this context.
No, you're a writer. I mean, you are. I'm sorry to tell you.
But that's sort of like, if I'm excited about how sort of strange some of these things are, and even if I doubt that whether or not some of this stuff is working, I'm hoping that sort of my own investment and enthusiasm and just sort of like nerdery, for this stuff will just come through, and people will just respond to that. And again, whether or not it like all coheres and fits together is less important to me than like whether or not you can, the feel of a text, right? I'm way more invested in what a book feels like than specific anything else, really.
No, it's phoning it in. You can tell when somebody's phoning it in. Like, I've read a lot of game tie-in fiction, BattleTech, Warhammer, D&D, and what Warhammer is, it's so clear whenever somebody has phoned in their novel versus when someone has like really, put their heart and soul. Like Dan Abnett, for example, like if you read a Warhammer 40K novel, like you can tell like he's into it, right? But I'm not gonna name any names, but there are other Warhammer novelists who you can, they're just kind of like, and I'm not sure how to, what are the specific techniques that they're using to kind of convince us that this is real. But there's a kind of, presence or lack of presence in texts. I think Hurled Headlong Flaming has that. You mentioned it was something you wrote when you were younger, but you're in your 20s, and so it's weird for me to like, I'm 41, so it's like, well, how much younger were you? Like 15?
Well, I am 31, but I did write this when I was still in my 20s, like late 20s. I probably, honestly, I don't even like, maybe like 4 years ago. Like, I want to say like this was around like pandemic times. I wrote a lot of this while I was working at a library, and I worked at this library
that's
through
considering what the novel's about.
What?
The library, working at a library. There's a library in the spoiler. There's a library.
Yes. I love libraries. Everyone go support your local public library. But yeah, I probably wrote this like in my late 20s. And this is like, that's basically a prequel to a novel that I had written earlier than that. So pre-pandemic, sometime in there. Also a large part of it written at this same library. But the novel, it was much more, it's set in the same time period. It's about monks in a monastery, and it was like, had a lot more, or what I was trying to do was a much more sort of contemporary realism feel. Like there, it does get weird and stuff, but it's still very like, again, contemporary realist is sort of probably not the most useful descriptor, but
like historical fiction
a little bit. But again, I'm not a historian, and I don't pretend to be, and so I did not do mountains of research to do this. But for the novella, I wanted to do something that was totally different, where it was not about individual relationships, like really human feeling individual relationships, or hopefully it was about like big mythic stuff that just like, Homeric or Miltonian, something like that, where I wasn't trying to necessarily, I just wanted to expand the scope, but at the same time, like sort of shrink the amount of words that I had, because a novel is a short novel. It's, I don't know, 55,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to sort of really expand the scope and at the same time sort of really pare down the actual words that you have. So I think there's something interesting that happens there where the lines start to mean a lot more and carry a lot more weight because there's just fewer of them.
Mm-hmm.
So to really capture or try to capture the sort of like grandiose or epic scale, it changes how you write. It changes how you approach certain scenes. Like you almost don't even think of them as scenes in some ways, because scenes feels too like specific in the moment. Like instead you're trying to think of like big gestures or I don't know.
Almost like verses. Well, like because I'm thinking you mentioned you didn't want to write a novel about relationships, and I'm sorry, you didn't want Hurled Headlong Flaming to be about relationships. You didn't want to be novelistic in that way. And like one of the the ways people have talked about novels in general is that they're all about the relationships, like the Jane Austen. It's all about social interactions, right? Like those are the earliest English novels are all like
Yeah.
groups of people and their relationships and the
Yeah, they're
psychodramas going on.
social novels. Yeah, like
Yeah,
it's about society. Like
yeah.
yeah,
And then but the epic poem, it's more about like, that I should say not the poem, but the epic narrative is more about just like, proceeding through. I'm not a no. My PhD is in 20th century literature, so I'm on thin ice too. But like,
yeah, me
I
too.
know that there are ways of talking about like epic poetry where it's like it's conflict follows conflict follows conflict, and it's like it's it's a journey, right? You're there's actually you have the stories, the characters are moving through through um a zone. It could be hell, it can be the ocean, going from trying to get home. It could be anyhow. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's not. I guess yeah, there's not. I mean, there are like other humans in this story, and
Mhm.
there is the sort of through line of like the bishop and the man he's talking to, Yakut. But the central relationship is kind of like the relationship that he has not only with himself but also just like with his faith and what he believes and his sort of morality and these
Mhm.
sorts of things, which again at the time I had just written something that was a lot more about sort of much more human relationships, but I, as a person and as a reader, I'm a lot more compelled by like those questions of self-doubt, and um, I'm particularly interested in violence and sort of um, the relationship that violence has to people, to things like faith, to spirituality, um, to all of that stuff. So I wanted to sort of, this is, specifically write a book that's like about themes in some ways, which is like the most sort of pretentious, like lit grad student thing that you could do.
No,
Um,
I mean,
it's
I have a theory about this novella, and the reason why I thought it was so compelling is because there's this uh, her name is Victoria Nelson, and she wrote. I have some friends who don't like Victoria Nelson, specifically Bobby Deary. I'm sorry to drop his name, but I'm imagining him being like, "Oh, you're still talking about her. He doesn't like her," but I think she's amazing, and she has this. He doesn't, when he says he doesn't like her, it's not personal. Her ideas do not resonate with him, I should say. But she has this idea of psychocartography, that there are certain stories that they're narratives, but they're really about like introspection. And she's really into like Lovecraft. She's actually in her book The Secret Life of Papa, she spends a lot of time talking about Lovecraft's horror as like psychocartography, like mapping of the mind. Like he's trying to work out his actual feelings of abandonment and xenophobia, and it comes out in the Cthulhu mythos, right? You remember Lovecraft has these nightmares when he's a kid, and then he has all sorts of, you know, this, his
Yeah.
both of his parents go crazy. There's a whole background there, but long story short, his fiction is an attempt to kind of map his psychology. Well, so that makes sense. I've often thought that, like, you know, I'm sorry if I'll come to a point where I think what's going on with your novel. You know, you have that Milton's Paradise Lost. I think there's a lot of psychocartography going on in that. Like, Milton is a Protestant. He's you know, but he's also anti-monarchy, right? And there's this moment of like slippage where, like, it's famous where, like, oh, you know, Satan's the bad guy, but the rebellious angel seems to sometimes become the hero. And so there's like this,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, so I think you're doing the psychocartography. I'm not sure what sort of psychodramas are going on where you are like I don't know if you're the bishop or not, but also you said you wanted to write a philosophical novel. And so you have this interesting moment where the genre starts to transform. We go from like psychocartography to literally a philosophical dialogue. I just think that's really cool. It's almost like you're blending two things. And it is pretentious. I'm not going to lie. Like, some people will
Yeah.
say like this is not Conan, but we don't. I mean, read the background. I mean, read the back of the book. Like, it's not Conan. It's not intended to be Conan. That wasn't
Yeah.
what I was interested in.
Yeah.
And I think Conan's great. And I think Conan has philosophical depth, but you're doing something very, very different, which is cool, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, you know, I mean, again, that's what attracts me as a reader. Like, I really like literary theory.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't necessarily like always get it or know what's going on or understand it,
Mm-hmm.
but I really like to read it.
Yeah.
And I think like the metaphor, the symbol of mapping is one that's been used for, I mean, centuries now, but like specifically in lit theory about providing ways. It's particularly like a postmodern thing. Like, I mean, the big famous one, right, is Jameson and his notion of cognitive mapping, of this idea that literature should build like new maps, or like we need new maps to sort of help us orient ourselves against like the problems of contemporary America at the time. I think that came out in like the 90s or something. But
1992, I think.
yeah, it's a useful, like, it's a really useful symbol to think about, and then sort of latch that onto you know, philosophies and things like this. Again, that's what's interesting to me. And like, so you have like the actual map that is sort of motivating the character, but there's also like behind it, there's the sort of psychological map, right? And yeah, changing, you know, I wanted to do the dialogue exactly as you're saying, like, because it harkens back to like philosophy. Like, this is the form that philosophy used to take. And I don't know if any contemporary philosophers now do dialogue. I'm sure there's somebody out there.
I'm sure.
But it's not near as prevalent of a form. Whereas before, like, that was the default form. Like, that's basically what you did. Like Galileo's treatise or whatever it's a dialogue. And I don't know.
Can I say one thing about the dialogue is that it's also, well, as far as I understand, I'm waiting. Notice how everything I do, I'm offering caveats because I don't want to say something that being in the academy too long, it makes me not want to say anything because I know there's going to be some expert who's going to offer like 6 other caveats.
There always is, man. There's always.
But like, the big tension in the genres of philosophy in the ancient world was between Aristotle's notes and Plato's dialogues. Plato's dialogues are more popular. They're more for like, they're polished and for consumption. And then the actual rigorous philosophy were these, like, you know, the poetics, rhetoric.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I think it's cool that you're writing the sword and sorcery, you know, genre, which is a, you know, popular genre, and then also using philosophical dialogue, which is arguably a popular, I don't know. But that was kind of
the that's always so interesting. I mean, this is also a tangent, but like the fact that what we have of Aristotle's writings are more or less like notes from like his students. Like, it's not like he wrote this stuff down and that's really what we have. Same thing with like Socrates, right? Like, Socrates only said what Plato had him say. But anyway, but
Mhm.
I also, the other reason for like the formal shift is just, I mean, one of it is my sort of lack of discipline as a writer, where I get kind of bored writing in the same form the whole time, the same mode or whatever.
Mhm.
So like third person, like limited third, right?
Mhm.
Sort of like the default. Um,
Omniscient or objective.
yeah. And so I wanted to have like a formal shift that would reflect sort of what's happening in terms of his quest, more or less. And then at the end, part 3 also has another shift where it goes to like the epistolary of like the first person journal entry, which
Mhm.
again is just, I don't really have a good reason for that other than just wanting to do something different and try to keep it interesting. Even though it is short, so it's not like, I mean, like you should be able to sustain interest the whole way, no matter
Mhm.
what your form is. But
Mhm.
for me personally, like I wanted it to sort of go through and give you like different accesses, not only to um, like different forms of thought,
Mhm.
because it does change how you write as a writer, like writing in third versus first versus doing like purely dialogue. It changes how you write, and it sort of reveals different parts of the character, I guess. And I'm
Mhm.
not really like a character writer. I don't think I'm like really locked in when when it comes to like characterization. Uh, but I think doing the different angles like that sort of helps to reveal different aspects of a person. It also just sort of shows you, formally, like the bishop doesn't talk a lot. So that dialogue, you get like his speech and sort of how he talks. And
Mhm.
granted, a lot of it's kind of performative, right? Like it's very conscious that it's all like an artifice that he's like putting on a show. But then you get like the journal entry at the end where you get more sort of like actual sort of deeper introspective moments of what he's thinking and some of the sort of crises that he's going through. Whereas in the first part, everything is very much like very physical, right? Like that's sort of how you learn about him, is all the action that he's doing.
Mhm.
um, and so part of it, that's sort of part of the reason why, I mean, there is a lot, again, I don't know how much all this stuff coheres. And I couldn't even say that like I'm consciously like, that's why I made those decisions. But like examining it now, those are some of the things that like I wanted it to do in terms of parts 1, 2, and 3 being not only different forms, but also like different sort of vectors into the characterization, like different attempts at a characterization. So
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I mean, I absolutely agree that different forms of writing are different forms of thinking, like different forms of cognition. You know, like a, a, a journal in the confessional mode. You know, the very end where you have like, you know, as much access as you can ever get to anybody, as like just kind of being in the stream of their, you know, their inner monologue. Like that's really cool. Like you're at the heart of that character at the very end. And then that middle part, I believe the dialogue, if I remember correctly, it's kind of a trial, right? Like he has to prove, you know, it's not
yeah,
just it's almost like it's like a court case, you know, it's like a
yeah,
defense, you know.
he has to prove. So like, and this is a pretty like direct point of influence that I can say like this is why I did this. But like used to students of rhetoric, and I'm not like a rhet comp person,
Mm-hmm.
but the university that I went to had a very like intensive, the teach there is very rhetoric heavy.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of like rhetoric stuff bouncing around. But anyway, rhetoric
That's
students,
hilarious. I wonder if they still do that, because I remember there was this period where like classical rhetoric was like on in the sophists were like on they had returned from, and everyone was becoming sophists again.
oh
I don't
yeah,
know if that's still a thing.
the one of my like mentors that I had on my committee is very much like a sophist, like all
Really,
the way.
that's
But
cool.
but
I mean,
anyway, like one of the things that they used to have to do, and this is something that Milton did, and I read these, they would have to do these exercises where they'd get up and they would give you some topic or whatever, and you would have to like just argue about it, right? Like
mm-hmm.
one of the 5 like pillars, canons of rhetoric is invention.
Mm-hmm.
And Milton had this essay, and this is again, like the direct line of influence where he has to argue. I can't even remember which side he's doing, but whether or not night is better than the day. It would be something. Some of it would be like heavy stuff, and then some would be like inconsequential things like that. So when he recalls like what his test was, it was to argue whether or not night was better than day. And the bishop is asked like where power comes from.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or like where, I can't even remember anymore, but it's about power. And that's what they ask him, like, why do you follow? Where does your authority come from? Basically, which is, again, to get like pretentious about it, is very much like me sort of. I mean, I've thought.
By the way, I am an English professor. You can't get pretentious with me. Like that's my whole life.
I mean, I agree. I love all this stuff, but I'm thinking about whatever audience might be listening to this, just being like, "Are you kidding me with these people right now?"
That's my whole life. Like I mean, and I know there's a time and place. Like I'm gonna, when I'm watching the Guardians here in the Cleveland Guardians here in the next 30 minutes, I will not be talking about the sophists, but
so like Foucault, and there are like two different sides. Michel Foucault, right? There's like the Foucault that writes like Discipline and Punish and History of Sexuality and Theory of Madness,
Civilization and Madness.
And then there's like the Foucault that did all the lectures and stuff. And they're two kind of, they're the same dude, but like there's different styles. And anyway, I'm not as versed in like his lectures and stuff. But I, as most like lit grad students are exposed to Foucault, it's within like the Discipline and Punish framework. And that book opens with this like very prolonged description that he's pulling from records, archival records, because he's basically kind of like a historian of like a torture sequence. And it's really explicit, and they're very specific about how they are torturing somebody. And like his central argument, or one of his central arguments, is that part of the spectacle of torture was to inscribe the power of the state onto the body of the victim, so that like that is where truth was created, because that's where the power of the state was situated. And it didn't matter whether or not it was true. What mattered was that the victim bore the marks of the state's power. And it was a spectacle, right?
Yeah.
And so that whole thing is basically like a rehearsal in some ways of Foucault's theories, but also I wanted it to come for the bishop from a place of like where he was, and I think this is like before in his timeline, it's like before he is a bishop, but like just reckoning with that, like being involved in, because I think like torturing somebody in any capacity like really breaks you as a person, like as a human person, and trying to reckon with that and deal with that is something that I'm really like interested in and invested in. It's part of why he reacts so violently in the beginning to the other guy getting tortured. But I'm just interested. I have read more than I should of like whenever that huge like Senate hearing document came out about like what was happening in the US's own, the US's own torture policies. It's like an 800-page document, and that's what was released to the public. But just reading that stuff and being like, man, like it's the same. We're doing the same thing, and it doesn't even work. It doesn't even work. At least back in the olden times, they recognize that we're not like producing like factual reality. We're just trying to like show that we're in charge. The US is trying to hide under the guise of like, oh, well, we're getting actionable intelligence from this. We're not just trying to like exert our authority, but anyway.
Well, we're dangerously close to getting real political, but I'm going to go there anyway, which is that there's the single body that has violence writ upon it to create truth. But then there are the body politics, kind of geopolitical power displays, like, I'm going back to 2003, whenever we went to, like there was the war in Iraq. I know that's like a lot of, I was an undergraduate then, but we were told this is because of like weapons of mass destruction and all this stuff. When in hindsight, I think it's fair to say that, I mean, maybe this is going to be a controversial thing, but did we go to war in Iraq because of 9/11? Like, was it this attempt to like, we've been wounded and therefore we need to like,
Yeah.
right our power. We need to and so because like, anyhow, we're getting dangerously political, but like this whole idea of like, but I find that really intriguing. Because Foucault talks about how like power stops taking the form of spectacle, and it ends up going into this like private place. Like power then starts to take place within these like institutions. It actually, you start being the source of your own power.
Yeah.
So like he talks about how originally we would publicly execute people, and then eventually we put people in penitentiaries where they're supposed to be penitents and punish themselves through reflection, and then like eventually like we're all just kind of enforcing,
Yeah.
and it's interesting in your story. It's like it just in the genre form. It starts with torture and it ends with a confession. Well, it's not an actual confession, but it's a journal written in this like Rousseau confessions style.
Yeah. And that's
So,
the thing, like power becomes diffused onto everybody, like it
mhm,
becomes distributed.
mhm,
And so like he is a representative of the church, and like the church as a system doesn't need to go out, and like the Pope doesn't need to go out and dish out the violence. Like that
mhm,
power has been spread and people access it in different ways. And because it has been diffused, you know, like anybody can take it up and
mhm,
say, in the name of whatever, I
mhm,
have the authority to do this. And so, and again, I think a lot about, again, like violence, like that's what I sort of wrote about in my own like academic work, but also, so in the novel or the novella, like that's a very much, it's kind of a central concern in a lot of my stuff, like whether or not, or what, like in terms of how do we make knowledge or make meaning or make mattering, um,
mhm,
does what type of knowledge, if any, does violence like create or contribute to? Because you have like people that are completely, obviously like no violence whatsoever, violence bad. But then you have people like Frantz Fanon, who I'm also like hugely influenced by for
uh-huh,
good and for ill,
mhm,
who his essay on violence is basically like an excuse. And it's, you got it, like his essay is very situated in the 60s and like the French occupation and stuff.
mhm,
Um, but he's basically saying like, look, if empire uses violence to make the world, that's all that they recognize. So the
mhm,
only way to try to make a world within the space that they've created, you have to be violent. And so it's basically a justification for like resistance, right?
mhm,
But this is a very different context, right? The bishop is fighting in these crusades, and again, I'm not a historian, so like I don't know anything about that, but
mhm,
I find it so fascinating as someone who is like also very invested in like scripture and the gospels, like the sort of wheels you got to turn to or maybe not for some people, but just like to think that you can amass all of Christendom. And I recognize that like Catholicism is not all of Christendom,
mhm,
but at the time it was very powerful state force.
mhm,
Uh, and then to justify it, that's why, I mean, the thing opens with like a sort of really like a repudiation, like from like Christ's own mouth, that like this is not the point here, people. And in
mhm,
fact, the original epigraph that I was going to use but did not for various reasons, but when Christ is like on trial
mhm,
and Pilate asks him, uh I can't remember exactly, he's like, they say you're a king or whatever, like where is, or is that true? And he says like, if my kingdom were physical, my followers would be defending me right now, but it's not.
mhm,
They'd be taking up the sword against you.
mhm,
It's like, how could you not have a more clear sort of, but anyway, so
Mm-hmm.
Even in something like faith or Christianity, where like supposedly violence is sort of like off limits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Put up the sword. Yeah.
yeah, put up the sword. That's not what we're about here. Like the kingdom is not a physical thing, but there's still people to this day, right, that will use um, not only scripture but also so many sacred texts, right, that have like anti-violence at their core and still use it to sort of justify, you know, what they think of as a good thing and they think of as like making something better. And I'm just really sort of, I don't know, fascinated
Well,
by that. And I wanted to sort of explore that, especially, I mean, sword and sorcery as a genre is very invested in violence in a very specific ways, right? And it's kind of already gone through a cycle of examinations of violence, right? Because you had like what Moorcock did, which is a
mm-hmm.
very sort of direct, not refutation, but just like counter maybe to how violence was represented in Conan, where it's just Elric has more consequences to his actions, right? Like he has more like suffering in his soul for how violent he is.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wanted to just keep spinning that wheel, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I don't think Elric is suffering from meaninglessness. Um,
Right. Yeah.
like it seems like what intrigues me about sword and sorcery, it's always intrigued me, is that is this was Charles Hoffman's essay, Conan the Existentialist. This is like a really old essay, and he was really young when he wrote this, but he was Conan the Existentialist, and has like a, in his defense, it's a young writer who's kind of being reductive in their understanding of existentialism. But like, Sartrean existentialism begins with like, the world is absurd. It's just this kind of wriggly mass of weirdness that then the existentialist hero has to paint their meaning onto. And that like what the sword and sorcery hero is doing is like, they really do feel the meaningless of it all. Like Conan in Samaria, like the gray wastes, this is like it's like a symbol for like the kind of meaninglessness of the world. And I think that it's not, it seems like it's pretentious to say Conan is in the business of meaning making, and one of his major colors for making meaning is red, right? And
Yeah.
but I think that's it. And I think that's like what I find really intriguing about Hurled Headlong Flaming, is that I think that you're and even as silly as we think that Conan movie is, like what's one of the most famous scenes that people always joke around with each other is when Conan asks what is best in life. It's like a philosophical question, and then there's that silly answer that, well, I'm not going to rehearse. I wish Matt John was here, he could rehearse it for us. But like that's a really, once again, really reductive view. But I think that you're right to connect sword and sorcery with a literature of meaning making, of like philosophical cartography. Like literally, like
Yeah.
that's what it's about. It's about like, and the guy who created sword and sorcery, um, he there are like legitimate, I don't think you could argue with the fact that Howard was struggling with deep philosophical questions. It might not, and I'm not,
Yeah.
this doesn't need to turn into like a hero worship of Robert E. Howard, but as the genre, I think, is clearly like a response to deep philosophical issues, and that like bishops are responding to, and philosophers, and
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, I mean, to speak of that, the Conan the Barbarian film, like, I mean, that film opens with like a quote from Nietzsche. Like,
there you go.
it's like telling you right at the front that like this is a sort of like philosophy is baked into this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Milius was like he thought about this stuff, but anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're totally right, and like Howard was, and I think like philosophy, like or just meaning making or existentialism or just like trying to sort of reflect on one's relationship to the world, which is sort of what philosophy's bag
Mm-hmm.
is deeply embedded in like the roots of the genre. And I think sometimes I think one of the things like, and this happens a lot with imitation, right? And this happened in like the 60s and the 70s where they would latch on to frankly the easier elements of Howard's stuff, which is like the adventure swashbuckling stuff. Like anybody can do that, man. Like
Mhm.
it's not but what the reason that it endures and the reason that it has depth is because Howard had depth about him, and he was like he was widely read. I
Mhm.
mean, he sort of had some big blind spots,
Mhm.
right? But you
I
can
do
tell
too.
in that work that he's like trying to think about something in an interesting way, which is also, I think, what philosophy is just thinking about things in interesting and or complicated ways.
Mhm.
So I mean, part of like uh and I want that's the part that attracts me, right? And I think honestly that's probably the part that attracts most people,
Mhm.
is that it has this sort of, there's something there, it's not only like all the adventuring and these sorts of things, right? It is also these like ponderings on human nature. I mean, that's why Lovecraft still endures, Clark Ashton Smith, like those dudes, like they were trying to figure something out, and Moorcock's the same way, right? Like these are, I mean, and again, to get on like the lit nerd thing, but like any
Mhm.
great like work, right, is invested in questions of like epistemology, right, which is
Mhm.
kind of what we're talking about. um and again, like this deals with that, the novella deals with that in sort of overt ways, I think, and that might, if that's not your bag, like you're gonna know pretty quick whether or not. But part of, like, I did try
If
to,
you're one of those sword and sorcery fans who's like, I just want to read for the swords and the titties and the monsters, and I just want a good yarn. It's like, well, you probably don't want to pick this one up. And
yeah,
that's I don't
there are
have anything
no,
wrong with that. Like
yeah,
I'm trying to look like I have some Gardner F. Fox over here on my shelf, you know what I mean?
yeah,
But like that's not this.
yeah, no titties. Originally there was like a so part of his process or his journey is like to go through various methods of like debasement, basically. Like
Mhm.
he's sort of forced into positions where he has to do things that are basically compromising to his soul.
Mhm.
um and so like in the part one, right, he sort of has to give in to this like brutality, this violence that was probably already there to begin with. And in part two, he has to admit, or fake admit, or whatever gymnastics he has to give to himself, that power comes from your ability to inflict violence on somebody. And not only that's where power comes from, but that's where truth happens, which again,
Mhm.
for like a bishop is, a big question. So in the final trial, I was gonna have him like basically be forced to participate in what it would have been like a prolonged sex scene, like an
Mhm.
orgy, more or
Mhm.
less. I went away from that because it got to feel too. I didn't feel like I had the emotional maturity to handle
That's
that in a
hilarious.
way that would work. Um,
I
but
mean,
so
Dante pulled it off with the cyclone of
he
you
did,
know,
yeah,
what are they called? The Paolo and Francesca.
yeah,
Pala, I can't say their names. The two famous sinners in the Tempest of Bodies. You
yeah.
know.
There's in the third part there is a direct reference to the Dante poem. Like I think
Mhm.
I want to say it's like popes that get buried underground. They have their
What?
heads
One
buried.
second. You mentioned the spectacle of violence.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And like uh my prayer candle here.
uh huh,
It's
uh
like
huh.
eh, like I'm like is the anyhow just thought like power rate on the body like it seems like it's like I'm not processing it right now, but it's an interesting connection to like the gospel account like you know uh,
Yeah,
I'm not, I mean like I'm an Episcopalian. I know this is more of a Catholic thing to have a votive a prayer candle, but I'm like thinking like it's really intriguing because it's almost like the resurrection is a refutation of the idea that truth is violence, right? Like
yes,
the
and yes, no,
that's
that is so true. And
Mhm.
this is like something that a big
Mhm.
swing and a miss for 2,000 years, in my opinion, is
Yeah.
that like Christianity has latched onto as a symbol,
Mhm.
like the crucifix. And again, obviously important,
Mhm.
obviously, right? Uh, but yeah, like it doesn't stop there though,
Yeah.
man. Like
Yeah.
there's another symbol on the other side
Yeah.
that is the one, but instead, like, I mean, yeah, how strange. I mean, I'm definitely not the first one to think about this, but like, how strange is it that so many people walk around with like a crucified man
Yeah.
on their neck, dude? Like,
Yeah.
that's hardcore. Like, that is some, like, I don't even know, like, just, the
Mhm.
spectacle of torture. And
Mhm.
again, there's something in finding like redemption, but again,
Mhm.
it's redemptive because of the resurrection, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I was saying, just briefly to close the loop, the Dante has the Pope's like little feet sticking out or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where like the little arms come from in the part
Mhm.
3 or whatever. Which again, just like I I am a writer who like I recognize that so much of writing is just like influences from a million different places. Like I completely reject the notion of like some sort of spontaneous origination. Like there is no origination in my opinion. It's just like everything's just swirling around, man, and we're
Mhm.
just like you just latch on, right?
Yeah.
And so I had read that recently and I was like, what a weird, bizarre image. And also just so fascinating for someone in like the 1300s or whatever to like come up with. So that's where the little arms come from.
Mhm.
But I just,
Oh, the battle scene is, uh, yeah, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it, but the disturbing like forced, prove yourself through murder, like that's some intense stuff. You know,
yeah,
I wanted that's actually what Jake Kelly is illustrating, or at least that's the scene I gave him on the
yes,
cover.
yeah,
Yeah.
like the amazing cover art by Jake Kelly is
Yeah.
incredible. And yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like this isn't like again, and I think one of the things I think he captures is like so much of it is symbolic, right? Like this isn't a physical representation of like a conflict necessarily,
Mhm.
but it's
Yeah.
like very symbolic of what's happening, which is
Mhm.
just like sort of devouring violence.
Mhm.
And I think a lot about like bodies and how we use our bodies, and again how sort of compromise not only your soul becomes or your humanity or whatever you want to call it, but like how your own body becomes part of that like uh like devolution basically. Like
Mhm.
um that's why he's like sort of naked the whole time, and he's like continually covered in layers of different types of stuff.
Mhm.
But the idea is like he's got to become so knowledgeable in violence that it covers up, it completely envelops him, and like again physically and symbolically, like it makes him into something else. Like it makes him unrecognizable in some ways.
It's
'Cause, yeah.
so That's so intriguing. It's like basically he has to turn himself into a monster, right? Like he's
Mhm.
like in order to engage in this philosophical dialogue, and you know, I'm gonna like be really pretentious, and I'm thinking of like Walter Benjamin, like what is it? No document of civilization is also not at the same time a document of barbarism. So like if you're
Yes.
going to engage in philosophical uh, dialogue, then there's a there's always going to be, to get that tea and that parlor and the air conditioning, there's like going to be a bunch of bodies behind you no matter what.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
really,
I'm glad you brought up Benjamin. He is another extremely influential thinker on me.
mhm.
Like,
Oh, that's
again,
awesome.
as he is for most anyone that study. Like, I mean, I basically sort of like drifted into like the like material Marxist approach to literature, and so I
Mhm.
like those are the people that or historical materialism, right? But his like theses on the philosophy of history.
Can
Uh,
I just say, because you said Benjamin is a materialist Marxist, but he was also really much a mystic too. Like I
oh
think
yes,
near the end, like
absolutely,
it I think it, because I'm really into like mysticism and
yes,
the occult and other forms of cognition that are not conventional. And I feel like Benjamin, it does it, I feel like it makes him sound safer than he really is
yeah,
to say he's a
yeah,
Marxist, because you would think Marxists are atheists, but Benjamin was not an atheist. He was I don't know, he read like weird stuff. Like I'm
yeah,
pretty sure he was a he was really into the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, and so like, but I'm sorry, I was because if you pick up a history of literary criticism and you read the entry on Benjamin, they don't mention that. I mean, they don't mention that part, but it's like almost like a sub.
Yes, no, he is
much
super
weirder than people.
He is very weird, and I think that's why I like him. And yeah, I'm pulling out my copy of because yeah, the last thing he says in his thesis on the philosophy of history is like part of the reason why he has this emphasis on like historical rupture and like trying to seize these moments of almost like, I don't want to say presentism, but like he's very into like the revolution and like disrupting time and these sorts of things. But the last sentence is here is, for every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. So like at any moment of time, he's like the revelation will happen, you know. And again, he's speaking from like a Jewish perspective, so he's not like, I don't want to confuse, he's not talking about like the second coming. But yeah, his stuff is like shot through with like mysticism, and you're right, I love it. He's
that right there.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's the whole emphasis on like the interruption, like the you know, like it's not eschatological, you know, like that right there is really weird to me, because, and that's also like we're going on a big tangent here, but that's also like his Marxist credentials come into doubt, which, you know, when people like refer to, because that whole philosophy is eschatological fundamentally, and he's talking about interruptions, like you know, like you don't, the revolution in a Benjaminian perspective is like it just happens and you don't know why it happened. It's just almost like a catastrophe that just like it's like a plane falls on your head or something like that.
And his there's my dog smacking herself.
Like, you're really getting into this.
She's like scratching herself and hitting her paw on the thing. But yeah, I mean, thinking about like the endless war, he has a passage in here about you know, like the angel of progress, right, is constantly like pushing everyone forward and pushing everyone forward regardless of whatever's just happened, right? And his point is, again, to stop, and where we perceive a chain of events, he, the angel, sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet, and he's being borne by a storm that we call progress.
Holy shit, hurled headlong flaming. I mean, that's not a very common verb, hurled, and you know, there's a film with a match on action.
Yeah, and I mean the title itself is taken from the Milton poem, but that idea of like the angel of progress being, or the angel being forced forward by the storm of progress, and behind it is an endless catastrophe of like wrecked human bodies, was very much, again, part of the like the soup or the ingredients that went into. And I hope for anyone like listening to this and thinking like this,
you're like, I'm never going to have a conversation with these guys.
Like the novella is like invested in these questions, but like I hope that it's still very accessible and approachable. It's like that stuff is there, but it's also just like a really, I mean, like the part of another influence for me is Mike Mignola, who I think also has like all of this like stuff going on in his head and all this like esoteric lore, and also Milton, also Dante, also the Bible. But he's also just like, I just want Hellboy to like punch stuff for like 20 pages.
Yeah.
It's like the greatest.
Preferably giant dragons or aliens.
Yes. It's like the greatest American comic that I think we have seen. And so that's also like, I just want.
That's not like, you know, puerile, you know, 2024 man children. They've been doing that since medieval times. Like if you read Dante's Inferno with the right mindset, it's like it's just as kind of phantasmagoric as, you know, X-Men.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, they're again like going to Milton, like book 6 is the big war in heaven, and it's just like, man, this is the coolest, like most rad stuff that he could come up with. And I like, there's a part of Milton that's like super just full of himself, and he's like, I'm gonna tell like the story of the redemption of man, and it's gonna be great. But there's got to also be a part of him that was just like, this is gonna be so cool.
That's hilarious.
And I
No.
think like I that this is just gonna be cool, and I just want this to be kind of awesome. That is also like very important to me as a reader, you know, like because I do get tired of writers that sort of I don't want to say preachy, but just like what
Oh
they're
yeah, no.
what they're trying to do just sort of seems to get in the way of like it's not fun though. Like you can do philosophy and make it fun. Like you can have your message and make it fun. Like I
Yeah.
you know, and I think so you know, there is all this stuff, you know, we're sitting here like two English PhDs talking, you know, Foucault and Benjamin and stuff, but there's also, you know, I try to anyway, just also just have it be fun. Like it's short. I hope it reads like I wanted it to read sort of quickly so you can kind of feel like the propulsive energy of what's happening. But but
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
like everybody compares. I know maybe I think I have a way of ending this conversation, but like everybody compares negatively, like Pulp Fiction. Um, you know, I should say everybody, not Sword and Sorcery fans, people who like Pulp Fiction. They're like, it's almost like it's an Pulp Fiction sci-fi fantasy horror is like a narcotic that like it's an opiate. You know what I mean? You snort a line of cocaine, and then you just have you read a Conan novel, and you just have this experience. But what they don't forget is that like after you have that like drug experience, you often have insights and revelations. You know, like I'm not saying, you know what I'm trying to say, like people take like Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. Like there's this idea of like you take the drug and then you have this insight, right?
mhm.
I think Pulp Fiction is like you have this phantasm. The point I'm trying to make is that Pulp Fiction does have philosophical credentials, and there's potential in that style of that kind of writing for exploring in-depth things. And the tension that you brought up, which is that like, well, when I'm reading my Karl Edward Wagner, I don't want Karl Edward Wagner to be like, preaching to me about philosophy, but I think that, I don't know what you think about Q, but I think that he's also another very intellectual, thoughtful writer. But how do you do that? How do you make like a frenetic, engaging, awesome Pulp Fiction story that's philosophically deep without like, turning into a novel of ideas? Like
Yeah,
nobody wants to read a novel of ideas if you're not in the mood to read Nausea by Sartre. You know what I mean? It's
yeah,
going to
I
bore you to
don't.
death. You know?
Yeah, I don't know, and I think that's sort of the key that probably like I think Pulp Fiction has an advantage because like contemporary realist writers, they have the same conundrum of like, I want to write about stuff, but I also have to make this entertaining. But
Mm-hmm.
all I have access to is like domestic drama.
Yeah.
And there's certainly like ways you can do that for sure, but like Pulp Fiction has this whole like canon of like wild and crazy stuff that like you can do both, and I think doing both is like the hard part, right?
Mm-hmm.
um I think Pulp Fiction gives you access to like the license of violence in a way that some other genres don't, and so you can play with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm attracted to with it. But it gives you just the weird stuff. It sort of taps into, I mean, frankly, like it has more in common with stuff like Milton and Dante, which, I mean, in terms of pedigree, no, but in terms of like the imagination, like what they're going for, like they're like going for it, you know, they're like, this world and reality is like not it, man. Like there's something else, and I want to write about it, and I'm going to use, you know, whatever. Milton wrote about, you know, fall of man. Dante wrote about hell. You know, Homer wrote about, you know, Greek gods and et cetera, et cetera. Like
You read
it's,
about being human, which
yeah,
is
you know,
what
yeah.
writers do. And I honestly think that Sword and Sorcery writers, um, are, right now, I would say, like, maybe this is being really egotistical, but like, I think it's cool. Like, so many people in sword and sorcery, like, fandom are just doing it for the love of it. Like, I know other people are, kickstarting and selling and this and that, but like, even though they're doing it, like, nobody's quitting their day job. It's so like everyone is just doing this because, you know, so I think that it's legitimately, I know Whetstone's an amateur magazine, but I think all of Sword and Sorcery is amateur in the best possible way, like doing it for the love of it. So there's a lot of sincerity and authenticity, and even with some of the people even the ones like, I don't know if he'll watch this, but I recently read. I know we need to. Well, I'm going to keep you on the Zoom for longer than you probably wanted to. But there are some writers who are clearly like, kind of their arms are crossed and they're like, I'm just writing fun stories. But even in their attempt to write really fun stories, and I don't want to name the specific person, they can't help but engage in some philosophy. So they're almost like doing like absurdism a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and say it. Like, I think Dave Risklin, some of his fiction is like, it approaches, like, he can't help but engage in a little bit of comedy, because I think that I think it's really good. Like, he's a talented writer. It's just, it's almost like it's like absurdist in like a Philip K. Dick sort of way, or not better yet, a Pynchon sort of way, Thomas Pynchon sort of way. But
there's a weird strain of, and I think there's a weird strain of anti-intellectualism that is bound up in that, right? Like, but I think like the word that you used, earnestness, I think is probably like the guiding light for, and should be for any writer of any genre, of any type, right? And this is kind of what I spoke on in the beginning, but like, you have to be genuine and sincere when you, because your reader, hopefully, like, they'll definitely be able to tell if you're just faking it, right?
yeah.
But like, genuine, like, earnest attempts at things, even if they fail, right? Like, I would much rather read something that's like experimental and weird and maybe doesn't work at all, but I can tell, like, man, this person, like, they really wanted to like do something crazy. And that's awesome, right? So I mean, I would encourage, if there's any lessons to take away, like, indulge in whatever like weird little interests that you have. Like, you can find a way to make it work. Like, this is technically like historical, but like, not really. But I wanted to have the veneer, because I wanted the conversations to be one-to-one with, for example, like Christianity. But you can just make it up. Like, you don't have to adhere to anything. Like, just be earnest, right? Like, actually just care.
Just care.
Yeah. Just care about what you're doing. Don't worry about the reader. Don't worry about, the market, whatever that even means. Like, just care about what you're doing, and take it seriously, right? Like, take it seriously.
Yeah. Have fun, but be serious about your fun. I don't know.
Yeah, have fun, but be serious about it. Like, that's because if you do actually want people to read your stuff, you have to, right? Because again, I don't want to read some work where I can tell, like, the writer just did not care, or they had nothing to say. And I know, like, I get, and I don't want to go there, but everyone has something to say. So, like, say what you want to say.
Yeah. We both have probably graded enough papers from students who didn't want to write a paper. Maybe that's why maybe it's okay. Maybe there are some people who like to read uninspired writing. I'm not sure I've had my fair share of uninspired writing.
Yes.
And it's usually three pages. A freshman comes. I have some great freshmen, though. I'm not giving them all a hard time. So
they're not all bad.
Yeah. I gotta watch, because then one of my students would be like, Dr. Carney was bad mouthing my writing. No.
Yeah.
Your writing's great. Some of it is. So.
Yeah. But thank you so much for just chatting again. I hope that we kind of talked about the book. But here again, the cover is just so freaking cool. And even if you don't even have to read the book. Like, just buy like 400 copies. I don't even care what you do with them. Just thank you so much for having the chat, and I appreciate it.
It's a great novella. Thank you. All right, well, this is the first one, so yeah, we'll see you around.